We here at the Edmund Rice Centre acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and in particular the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, as the first and traditional custodians of the land on which this building now stands. We acknowledge our gratitude that we share this land today, our sorrow for the cost of that sharing, and our hope that we can move towards a place of justice and partnership together. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Ray. And can I say welcome also to Pastor Ray tonight, who is one of our advisory council members now, as well as being obviously a great person in his own right in the community and as part of the journey for many in faith and also within our First Nations community. So thank you, Pastor Ray. I have printed out a little bio that I haven't run past Reverend James, but I'm going to read it anyway because I thought it was fantastic. So Reverend James Bhagwan is a multifaceted visionary, blending spiritual leadership with grassroots activism to catalyze positive change. Ordained in the Methodist Church of Fiji and Rotuma, his journey is marked by a profound commitment to justice, compassion, and interfaith dialogue. With a foundation in theology and a heart for community empowerment, Reverend Bhagwan's impact extends far beyond the pulpit. He has emerged as a beacon of hope, navigating the complex intersections of faith and social responsibility with unwavering dedication. Throughout his career, Reverend Bhagwan has championed numerous causes, from environmental stewardship to human rights advocacy. And we had a very interesting conversation today about the situation in West Papua at the moment. And it is one of the areas of human rights that we in Australia tend to have a blind spot to. And I'm assuming Reverend Bhagwan might touch on that as part of the conversation tonight. He's a vocal advocate for marginalized communities, amplifying their voices on local, regional, and global stages. As a thought leader, Reverend Bhagwan inspires transformative dialogue and action. His insightful teachings deeply challenging individuals and institutions alike to confront systemic injustice and embrace inclusivity. Beyond theory, he leads by example, rolling up his sleeves to engage in hands-on initiatives that foster tangible change. From community development projects to interfaith collaborations, Reverend Bhagwan's leadership is rooted in empathy and solidarity. We were talking again today, and he talked about his role as, is it the flag holder for the ship, the canoe that travels the world, the Polynesian and Fijian canoe that is part of this journey of engagement, and it's a big responsibility alongside everything else. He's responsible for making sure nothing happens on that. His work has garnered widespread recognition, earning him accolades as a bridge builder between faith traditions and a catalyst for reconciliation, whether leading worship services, facilitating workshops, or mobilizing grassroots movements. Reverend Bhagwan embodies transformative power of compassionate leadership. In a world hungering for hope, he stands as a beacon of possibility, inspiring individuals and communities to join hands in building a more just, equitable, and compassionate world. So without further ado, I hand over to Honourable Reverend James Bhagwan, Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches.
Thank you, Epeli. And I begin by acknowledging, as we have already this evening, the Vanua, the Gadigal people, and the Eora Nation, or the Matinitu ko Eora, as we would say in the Fijian language, and acknowledging our elders past, present, and emerging in this place that is always has been and always will be unceded territory of these people, our Indigenous sisters and brothers. And also my appreciation and thanks for the invitation to be here and not only participate in the Epeli Hau'ofa Memorial Lecture on Thursday, but this kind of conversation as well, because otherwise I might be forced myself into having a day off or something. So it's good to be working. It's a work day. And thank you for the introduction. Could you please send that to me so I can send it to my wife to use in my eulogy or something when I die? That's yeah, no, but it's really good to be here. I'd like this to be as much of a conversation as possible for us here, those online, and acknowledge our friends joining us online from whichever part of the Pacific or the world that you are in today, or in the land now called Australia. And maybe to just do some scene setting for us. I was asked the question today, why should churches be involved in climate change? And I was like, read some stuff about what's happening around the world. There's a lot of things that we need to be involved in. And I gave a response about, the role of faith communities to mobilize and speak for justice. I want to reflect very briefly on a passage I read just before COP26. And I was, I just arrived in the UK, and, this is 2021. The borders had just opened in many places. When I left Fiji, I had a whole row and half a plane to myself from to LA, from LA to Europe, where I was going, or to the UK. I had, a quarter of the plane to myself, and then flights in Europe were like cramped so much I had 3 masks on. But I arrived in London, and I was I went to the Royal Exchange in London, which is right next to the Bank of England. And I was there to speak and support our Pacific climate warriors. And of course, because I came on a plane and took the train over, I was there sort of a bit earlier than everybody else. And it was still a bit too cold for me to change out of my jeans into my sulu that I like to wear for when we speak on behalf of the Pacific. And so I was standing around just looking at the armed guards in front of the Bank of England or the Bank of London, whichever it was. And I looked across to the Royal Exchange, the Royal Stock Exchange, and thinking about all the trading that has gone on in that place, slavery, sugar, every other kind of extraction that has taken place throughout history. And then I looked up, and sort of on the facade, on the sort of the behind part of the building, were these words: "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. For he founded it on the seas and established it on the water." Just the first half of this particular verse from Psalm 24, verse 1 from Psalm 24 was written there. And I thought about it and I said, yeah, the earth is the Lord's, and given the state of the earth, I think he wants it back. But I think that is the challenge for us, recognizing that as human beings, from a Christian perspective, recognize we are created in God's own image. We are called to serve as responsible caretakers of God's precious and unique creation, of which we are at the same time part of. And I think one of the challenges we faced in this world is that we've kind of separated ourselves from the rest of creation. And the following year, we had the World Council of Churches Assembly in Karlsruhe in Germany. And one of the statements that came out of the WCC Assembly was what's called a Living Planet Statement. And it was a call to global metanoia, repentance and renewal, and restoring the relationship with creation and how that engages us in our lives. And that assembly actually ended up inaugurating a new or forming a new commission, the WCC Commission on Climate Change and Sustainable Development, which is only met for the first time just a few weeks ago. One of the key things that has been acknowledged around the world is that we're running out of time. And I sort of lightly referred to the fact that the faith communities of the world account for about 80%, 70 to 80% of the world's population, and can be mobilized for good. I think we still have a lot of work to go when we see the religious-inspired violence around the world and apathy, or the use for religion to continue to dominate, to continue to exploit and extract. And last year, as we were gathering in Dubai for COP28, 30 years of discussions and not much movement, the lack of recognition of the need to phase out fossil fuels urgently. I was looking at Pope Francis's the latest encyclical, Laudato Deum. And it was quite interesting to me because it was, I think, the first time that there's been a sequel to an encyclical. We usually only have that in the movies, but now we have a sequel because it was really just, re-emphasizing that need for decisive action, and actually also calling out the fact that COP28 was held in a major fossil fuel producing country with the president of the COP as one of those executives. But, climate change for us in the Pacific has been articulated as the single most significant security threat for Pacific people. And this has come from the Pacific Islands Forum leaders. It's something we've been talking a lot about. And in the space that we talk a lot about security in the Pacific, we are reminded that it's not China, it's not traditional weapons of mass destruction that affect us most, but what we call weapons of mass environmental destruction. And I'd like to, balance that, because I do recognize that there is a military climate nexus, and there's a huge lack of transparency and accountability for military emissions in international climate agreements. None of the IPCC reports are able to find a measurement of the carbon emissions from militaries and military actions and wars. But one study that I saw highlighted that militaries worldwide contribute approximately 5.5% to total greenhouse gas emissions, which is the equivalent of a country, basically. Just to give us some of that understanding of, 20 or 30 years down the track of climate change conversations, and we still are not getting a full picture of what the situation is. And at the same time as we have that, we have what we call 422 so-called carbon bombs, which are fossil fuel projects, coal, gas, etc., oil, which are either being activated or in the pipeline to be activated. And of course, there are some of them here in the land now called Australia. These carbon bombs will take us twice beyond the limits of 1.5 degrees. And 1.5 degrees is not just a number that's been picked out. For Pacific Island countries, it is the red line. Last year, that was what our Pacific communities were saying. For the planet, for us in this space, it is the red line for life and death for many people. And, if you look at the recent extreme weather that we've been having around the world, we've just come back from floods in Fiji. We have droughts in the marsh, in Kiribati, etc. And so this lived reality continues to be the cry that we share, but is not matched, unfortunately, by the action that needs to be taken. And as we look at the role of faith communities in our region and in the world, there is something we really need to do to figure out how do we mobilize, and what is the role of faith communities and of leaders who are not just faith leaders, but political leaders who say that they subscribe to some sort of faith spirituality. How are they living out this faith in political realities? In the Pacific, as in Australia, there is a deep indigenous spirituality, which I would like to acknowledge, which is at the heart of the way in which we see the world. It's at the heart of our relationship with each other and with the environment. And more and more so as we unpack our Christian faith, and particularly with sort of 90+% of the Pacific being Christian, churches have embraced this and bringing together both the indigenous spirituality and Christian spirituality, which understands our role as guardians and stewards of creation rather than exploiters of creation. This has been something that is part of the motivation for us to engage in climate justice, apart from just the experience that we have. This year, we marked, just a few weeks ago, the 20th anniversary of the first major declaration on climate change by Pacific churches and Pacific church leaders. There was a meeting in 2004 in Kiribati, where church leaders issued what is called the Ocean Tide Declaration. And next month, we will have a major conference around that to bring churches back together and reflect on what were the calls made by Pacific churches in 2004, and where have we got since? What has been the result of those calls? Who's listened, who hasn't listened, and where are we? And that declaration, along with the Moana Declaration, which was made in 2009, not Moana, the animated movie, although that's a nice movie to watch, but these two declarations ushered in the prophetic role of Pacific churches to engage with the devastating impacts of climate change and climate-induced displacement and relocation. So it's been 20 years since we even started talking about the issue of climate-induced displacement and relocation. And that was reaffirmed in terms of issues we need to look at in 2009 with the Moana Declaration. And so last year, Pacific church leaders met in the Marshall Islands, in the capital of Majuro. And this was the first major Pacific church leaders meeting in the Northern Hemisphere since 2004. And I remember traveling with some of our church leaders who come from bigger island countries, that are not coral atoll countries, from Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, Samoa, American Samoa. And you have to fly from, everybody flew into Nandi, and then from Nandi to Kiribati, to Tarawa, and then you fly across on an island hopper to the Marshall Islands. And we spent about half a day in the Marshall Island, in Kiribati, on Tarawa. The first thing that our current moderator from the one of the churches in American Samoa said to our colleagues from PCC, as we were standing in the airport, he's standing there, we've just been sort of protocoled in, and we're sort of having refreshments, and then we're going to have lunch, and then they go out to see Tarawa. So this is his first impression at the airport, looking at the runway, and he's looking around and he goes, I don't see any mountains. It's something we kind of take for granted. When you look out and see the blue mountains, and we went to some mountains today and looked around, and I could see the wheels turning. And then they went out and visited Tarawa. They went to places where they saw how the king tides will just wash out from the ocean, just straight across the land into the lagoon. And it was a reminder, because sometimes, out of sight is out of mind. We get caught up in our own issues. It was just a really important reminder to them who come from bigger countries or volcanic island countries, what that reality is. And we went to the Marshall Islands, where they had more engagement on this issue. And at the end of the meeting, I just wanted to share what the church leaders put out as part of their closing declaration or statement. They said, as we continue to face the brunt of climate change, we confess that we have not done enough to prick the conscience of our congregation and governments, and we pledge to do more. And then they went on to talk about climate finance, because a lot of money comes, and not enough, but there's a lot of discussion about climate finance. And they said, we reaffirm that climate finance for adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, and relocation by polluting countries is akin to receiving 30 pieces of silver for the betrayal of Pacific Islanders who seek first and foremost a rapid phase out of fossil fuels. And then they went on to call Pacific Island countries and those who would be friends of the Pacific, or those who seek to be friends of the Pacific, to commit to and campaign for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, for rapid, coordinated, transparent, and equitable transition away from fossil fuels, including and in particular access to renewable energy and low carbon solutions. And of course, the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty campaign has been led by Pacific Island countries, particularly Vanuatu and Tuvalu, and other countries coming on board. Acknowledging that Pope Francis in Laudato Deum called for the end of the fossil fuel era. And this is something that's quite significant for us to think about the call for a phase out of fossil fuels. So Pacific countries Pacific churches who are members of the World Council of Churches took this as one of their key asks to the WCC Central Committee last year, and were able to get the World Council of Churches to come on board to endorse the fossil fuel treaty. And working with this gentleman across just here, Damon, to try and build more engagement with the Catholic Church and hopefully the Vatican to come on board. But what was really interesting at COP last year was the announcement of Colombia, which is a fossil fuel producing country. 10% of their GDP, 20% of their exports account from oil and gas, and they also extract coal. And they made a commitment to join the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative and campaign, becoming the first of these fossil fuel producing countries to join. And I quote here the words of President Gustavo Petro, who's president of Colombia. He said, "The death of all living things, the interconnected extinction of everything that exists, is an homicide for the life force of the planet." And that was the reason behind their commitment. But later on, when we had discussions, they started talking about the ecological conversion that Pope Francis mentioned in Laudato Si. And, it's really great to get all these statements and messages that come out from faith communities. And talking about the fact that they had recognized the suffering of vulnerable countries like the Pacific, Bangladesh, other places that are affected, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa in particular, and the Horn of Africa. And they had noticed that their own people were suffering from the impacts of climate change. And they said to themselves, well, we've got to do something. And while some of their opponents or critics talked about economic suicide, they said, economic suicide versus omnicide. Which one is more important? We can control the economic aspects, we can phase, but if we don't act, then we have this omnicide. And here is an example of what happens when political leaders are impacted by faith, by spirituality, by the conviction of faith leaders in their community or their faith community. And I think for me, that's something that's quite significant of the role of faith in addressing climate change. And for us, we talk about climate change at PCC and in other colleagues that work on this in the Pacific from a justice perspective. So we talk about climate justice, the injustice of what is happening as a result of climate change. And for very long periods of time, it was the Pacific and some of these vulnerable communities that were at the forefront, but now everybody's experiencing it. And across the world, it's always the most vulnerable, the most poor, the marginalized communities who get further impacted by the impacts of climate injustice and climate change. For us in the region, we have found Pacific Island countries going further and further into debt because to do the adaptation, because the climate financing is not coming fast enough, they are having to borrow more and more funds. Of course, as we have countries who want to be friendly with us. Often it is not grants yet. A lot of it is soft loans, but soft loans are still loans, and they will come into play at a certain time. So imagine countries that are already impacted by climate change getting further impacted and then having to pay loans back. And this is the big issue. And we continue to see unabated extraction of fossil fuels and other environmental degradation in the name of development. And we are mindful that in the move to new renewable energy, that there are other forms of extraction that will take place in mining, seabed mining, etc. So the role of the church is to be that prophetic voice. But as I was sharing with Alopi also earlier today, the role of the church is also to be the pastoral hand of God in this place, to be the compassionate people, to work with people who are facing the impacts of climate change. And here we have people who are impacted by extreme weather, floods, cyclones, storm surges, droughts, etc. What is the role of the church in that space? What is the role in the church of people who are having to be relocated as a result of climate change and the impacts of climate change? And how do we ensure that their needs, not just their physical needs, but their cultural needs, their spiritual needs are taken care of as well? And what are the practical aspects that we need to engage in supporting our communities? We are people who are, as people of faith, who, as we are reminded, fishers of, and I'll try and be politically correct, fishers of people, fishers of men, but fishers of people. We need to make sure that the net of the church is not so big enough, or the gaps in the net are not so wide that we leave people behind. And often that is the thing. After first wave, second wave of interventions come in, it's usually the church and our local community organizations who are sweeping at the back to see what's going on, who's left behind. And so we are trying to see, as churches, what do we need to do to care for our people? How do we help our people also understand what's going on? I'm sure many of you have seen the progress in some of these conversations. At the time of the Osintai Declaration, the response to climate change was rainbow theology, which was about, God came and put the rainbow after the flood. I'm not going to flood the earth ever again, so this will not happen. But it's not God that's flooding the earth. It's not God that's raising sea levels. It's our own people. It's humankind doing this. And so there's a constant need for churches and faith communities to help people understand what they're going through and speak to them and guide them. And, we are very fortunate in this space that it's not only the churches that are working, it's other civil society groups. It's growing more and more. But the question I would like to leave us to ask and reflect on is, how do we catalyze? How do we catalyze movements? How do we catalyze faith communities? What faith communities are not part of this engagement and discussion, and how do we bring them on board as well? So I'll leave my sermon for this Tuesday night, and open up if there's any questions or discussions.
I think there will be. I am thinking quite a few, but if we online could, if you don't mind, if you could add your questions to the text, but if you can't use the text for any reason, if you can put your hand up to allow for us to see, and we can throw to you in the case where you can ask a question via voice. But thank you so much for a very, very, very thoughtful reflection, James. I think one of the things that jumped out at me immediately was this question of the role of those of faith in being able to influence the world of, I guess, decisions that are made not necessarily through the lens of those of faith alone. You know, it's economics, it's government, it's vested interest. But obviously there are links to many of these networks by those of faith who can potentially be an active participant. So perhaps I could take the opportunity to ask that question, how, and perhaps open the floor if there are thoughts on this. How do people come to the different ways to engage decision making in a way that's influential?
Yeah. Well, I think this is I mean, again, I reflect from my context, and I encourage you to think on what I'm sharing from your context. People of faith are everywhere. But people of faith are not just religious leaders. People of faith are accountants, serving in the military, working in hospitals, ordinary people, the people of faith. So sometimes when we talk about faith communities, we just rely on faith leaders to step up and make the statements, but we all belong, we're all part of faith communities. And I acknowledge that a lot of our Pacific Island civil society workers are not just working on issues of justice because that's the thing to do, or because they want to work for an NGO, or it's their faith perspective, it's their faith that's driven them to address the issues of injustice. So climate injustice is ecological injustice, it's development injustice, it's racial injustice, it's economic injustice. And, looking at it from that perspective, the faith perspective is the motivation for justice. And how we engage on it is really from the different spaces that we can engage in. So, this, and because climate action is also economic action. Yeah, it's also political action, it's development action. And so, we were talking in the car today about when you go and engage, what is the ask? What are the shifts that need to take place? And sometimes we make very broad statements, and that's important because we want to call things out, we want to reframe, we want to say where we need to be. We want to give hope that there is a possibility, there is a way, but how do we also take those steps? What are the steps that get there? And those are very practical steps. Those sometimes have to be pragmatic as well. How do we shift the dial? What's the increment? And in all of those spaces, that's where different spheres of life are involved. I have said this and I continue to say this. I believe that our indigenous communities in the Pacific and the land now called Australia around the world hold the key, because it is reminding us that there is a need to live gently with the environment, and that we can live without this culture of excess. And I think that's the thing that usually motivates people in the opposite direction, the fear of not having things, as opposed to actually realizing what we are dealing with in terms of the possible extinction of human life and many other parts of creation as we go forward. So it's the science, it's the economics, it's the politics, and that includes many people of faith working in those spaces. It's artists. I did a devotion for the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Yeah. I always forget the acronyms. There were too many acronyms in faith and in politics. They were writing the special report on oceans and cryosphere. So this was a couple of years ago, and they were writing about where we are in terms of the ocean and what it means as ice caps and everything else melts. And it was interesting because it was in Fiji, and they said a Pacific culture, devotion, wheel out a pastor to say a prayer. And But I reflected on science and faith, or science and spirituality, being almost two sides of the same coin. One is the what is happening, the how it's happening, and this is the why we need to do things, the justice aspect. And a few years later, at COP26, there was the Faith and Science Declaration. So what we're seeing is more and more collaborations between faith communities and other communities as more people recognize the need for change. There are collectives of Christian or faith, people of faith who are businessmen, business people, or run businesses and corporations who are trying to make the shift. If you look at the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty campaign, and you just look at the list of faith communities, civil society, and other groups joining on, states, cities, universities, business organizations, it shows that we can mobilize. And it's just the need to really for us to try and find ways to do that in how we do our advocacy. So maybe not all of our advocacy needs to be focused just at government. It's those who government work with, who lobby and motivate the other side of things. How do we work for them or work towards dealing with them? Yeah.
It's a couple of questions.
Yeah, so I just wanted to also acknowledge my team tonight. Jafar, who's sitting behind and who is here. His family is foregoing him tonight to be here tonight, and also Corinne as well, who both have come and are helping out tonight. So I just want to acknowledge both of them for being part of this conversation and helping to make it happen. So we've got a couple of questions.
Thanks, Alopi. Yes, we have a question from Christine from ACRAF. ACRAF is another another complicated one, but it's an organization that works on human trafficking. So Christine says, thank you so much, Reverend Bhagwan, for tonight and for your leadership. We in ACRAF are working to support Pacific Islander temporary migrant workers in Australia. How do you see global warming as a push factor moving workers to Australia?
Thank you. So we have the PALM scheme here in Australia, the short-term seasonal workers and the longer term. We've had 3 weeks of torrential rain in Fiji, floods, and just before I came over, a young man was showing me his on a messenger, showing me his plantation, and he showed me his taro crops. And he said, this is coming along, and then he showed the beds where he was trying to plant cabbage and a few other things, and turmeric and other things that he could sell. He said, I can't plant anything, it's all flooded. We go from that to drought, and these are things experienced all over the world. We go from that to saltwater inundation. And we continue to see these issues being, some of them are the push factors. But I think they're not the only factors in terms of these PALM scheme workers coming in. There are, of course, economic issues in some of the countries, and the fact that there is, money to be made that's probably more than they could earn doing teaching and other things. So we're not seeing unemployed people coming. We're actually seeing in a lot of the cases some well-educated people who give up jobs to come, and that's because the economies in their countries can't support this. But that underlies a different reason. As I said earlier, countries are going into debt as a result of climate change adaptation, and so they're not able to afford investing in the services that they should be providing. And so, this is just another form of extraction where people are brought in, and the impact that has on a number of communities. When it's time for when a natural disaster occurs and the community has to get organized, the young people are not there. They've gone for seasonal work. So it's left up to the the elder generation, and I'm sure all the elders sitting here are fit enough to do that work. But, you know, I mean, when you've got half of the workforce in your community or 3/4 gone to pick fruit and vegetables in Australia, who's there? Who's there to help in rebuilding the community after a natural disaster? So those are some of the impacts that will happen. And as people see more and more impacts of climate change and worry more and more about their future, some of them are being proactive in moving. And they become very vulnerable.
Thanks, James. Question from within the room? Maybe?
Happy to break the ice if that's helpful. Thank you very much. That was very powerful. And I really appreciate your reflections on, sorry, I'm Julianne. And I'm working for Oxfam Australia. I really appreciate your statements about or your examples of the Pacific leading in the past and how often the Pacific has led and driven action and others have taken sometimes a remarkably long time to follow. So I've worked on loss and damage, and obviously the Pacific have for 30 years been calling for a loss and damage fund. Last year we got some commitments to one, but we've still got a long way to go on that front. I guess I was very interested in your thoughts on Australia has shown interest in hosting COP31 with the Pacific. And yet there has been some reporting that Australia is perhaps going a little bit cold on the idea of hosting COP31. And I would see Australia hosting COP31 in conjunction with the Pacific, whilst fraught, a good opportunity to highlight the challenges in the region and to potentially bring Australia and the Pacific closer together on the issue. Australia moving to the Pacific perspective, not the other way around. So I wonder if you had any thoughts on the role of the Pacific in that equation, and ways that Australian civil society can support.
Yes, I do. I have a lot. I mean, you know, Fiji hosted, well, in conjunction with Germany, hosted COP23 in Bonn. And I was very disappointed because it became more of a Fiji tourism exercise than really an opportunity to champion the Pacific. And I think the rest of the Pacific were disappointed in that. And now we have another opportunity, and I know it's going to be tough for Australia because they are up against Turkey in that. And there's a lot of politics in who gets nominated. And often there's sometimes there's last minute changes. The COP in Chile was then moved to Madrid as a result. I think first and foremost, I acknowledge that it is an attempt to have discussions and present it as a Pacific and Australia COP. First and foremost, I think that the Indigenous First Nations people of Australia need to be involved in that conversation first, because they have experienced already over centuries the dispossession that people experience as a result of climate change. But in terms of response to climate change in Australia, I believe it's the Indigenous people that will lead Australia in that work and in that space. And that requires listening by Australia. And then, of course, we have the Pacific diaspora who have family back home who need to be engaged. And I'm talking about the internal discussions within Australia before even engaging Pacific Island countries. And then you engage the Pacific. And, I want to acknowledge here that there is a willingness for that engagement. Australia is part of the Pacific Islands Forum, which is the body that made that declaration of climate change being the most important security issue for the region. Australian government is supporting us at PCC with our OSINTAI +20 conference as we reflect on the 20 years since the churches made their first declaration. And we've said that they need to start engaging with Pacific communities, Pacific civil society, Pacific climate advocates now. But they need to, of course, as you've highlighted, they need to lead by example. So what will Australia do to show that it's serious about climate change and really responding to what's happening in the Pacific? In the past, there has been, and I'm not referring to just to this government, to the previous governments as well, there's been a unfortunate use of climate finance as a way to build bilateral relations with the Pacific, with Pacific Island countries. And so in the past, we would see funding going, and even last COP, was it 100 million, 150 million, something like that, 100 million to the Pacific Resilience Facility. Half a billion was announced at COP26 in Glasgow in 2021. And none of this money is going into the climate fund or even will go into the loss and damage fund. So this money is being used to strengthen relationships with the Pacific rather than actually show commitment to the issue of climate justice. And the argument is, of course, that we are taking care of our family. But it comes. At the same time, though, there is very, very little done in terms of the mitigation. The continuing, even with this government, opening up new fossil fuel projects. And so, where we look at the shift to renewables that's taking place, we look at the fossil fuel treaty as well as a good example. The fossil fuel treaty is not a UN treaty. It's a campaign. It's an initiative. It's a commitment towards a just transition. That's really all it is. It's saying we commit to being part of the change. We commit to doing this quickly along with others. It's a show of solidarity with Pacific Island countries and other neighbors for Australia in that sense. And so we'd like to see some of this happening as well as we move forward.
Thanks, James. We've got a question from Dermot from WWF. The idea of the blue Pacific as a notion of peace is a newish geopolitical concept coming from the Pacific Leaders Dialogue. I don't fully understand the details, but was wondering if you know more on this and whether this framing fits easily into the faith-based community narrative you spoke about tonight.
Dermot, I hope you're coming to the Epeli Hau'ofa lecture on Thursday, because that's what I'm talking about. This is a little bit of a tease. And I think if you, there are some articles around that, the Ocean of Peace. There are people starting to write on it. It was so. I think if you dig around a little bit, you will see that, and I'll expand more of it on Thursday. That's okay. Be there or be square. Yeah.
Okay, another question from Shiva from Greenpeace, whom I know you know. As someone who has worked so deeply and meaningfully with both civil society and engaged with government in the region, what do you think is the responsibility of Australian climate CSOs within this space? As many times there is this argument that the Australian CSOs tend to ask too much of the Pacific CSOs and peoples to push the Australian government, as well as the use of tokenistic relationships.
Shiva, we've had this conversation many, many times. No, but thank you, my brother from Ba. I think, yeah, this is an important issue. What is collaboration? What is true collaboration in this space? And I think this is part of the challenge we face. What is equitable partnership? Because if we just impose on the Pacific and ask them to kind of fit our narratives of campaigning, we are doing more injustice again. So it's, for me, it's about, if you want the Pacific's voice to be heard, make the space and invite the Pacific to talk. Whether it's telling stories, whether it's showing what they're trying to do. And there are some amazing, we talk a little bit about vulnerability here, but there's some amazing stories of resilience. And giving space to the Pacific and giving them the space to do what they want to do. And as you've said, the Pacific countries are, I often, we use the boxing term in this, they punch above their weight. Sorry for the violent metaphor. But it's, for me, it's an amazing thing because we see, because of the situation of climate change, civil society, government, and church, who can disagree on many things back home in the islands, whether it's governance, whether it's economics, all kinds of issues, politics, everything else, come to this issue, we all work together. You go to the Pacific Pavilion at any COP and you will see government representatives, civil society, faith-based, all working together. And I think that's something that we need to recognize in that space. What does collaboration really look like? And, there is a concern, particularly in terms of how our young people who are very strong in advocating climate justice, how they can be used. And you cherry pick and you take the best talking, best looking ones who can do all the bits, and then they get put up on the stage. And their capacity hasn't been equipped to deal in bilaterals. So when they come off the stage and they go into conversations or negotiations, they don't know what to say. They haven't been briefed. They don't have the confidence. And so this is something that we need to really focus on. And I hope to see that as we go towards, if there is COP31 as a Pacific Australia COP, it's not just the Australian government, it's Australian civil society engaging with Pacific civil society at an equal, regardless of who's paying the bill.
Thank you. Alopi?
Yeah, no, thank you. And I actually was quite interested in your references to Australia listening to its First Nations. And perhaps I could throw to Pastor Ray, if that's okay, just to, in the spirit of Talanoa, if you have some thoughts on that, because given you chaired the IPO, you had a role in the discussions last year around what that might mean. It would be great to hear from you about your thoughts on that particular idea, in lieu of what we've gone through in the last year.
If there was way in which we could kill that idea, that'd be great, first and foremost. But we're putting a big burden on us that we don't necessarily want to carry. The reason behind that is that Australia had the chance of giving us that voice last year, and it kicked us out the door again. So we don't see any leadership filling that gap to give some kind of a vision for the future. And we don't see that only here in Australia, but we see that through the Pacific, we see that through the whole world. The kind of global leadership or even local leadership or national leadership is now, I think, in my opinion anyway, it's a bit of a myth. And we've lost those chances that many times. We also see, the whole notion of democracy being eroded globally anyways. And what fills that gap, I don't know. We've just lost a lot of ground in that last referendum, and we have not yet recovered from that. I don't see the church either as being a part of our salvation. I see it a part of our problem more than our salvation. We're running a series on leadership, actually, and we're asking that big question. You've got the three major religions of the world And they've always been at perpetual war with each other. And I think we in Australia, as well as I hope in the Pacific, should be asking the question, what's the benefit of this to us? If this is what Christianity is all about, or the church is all about, where's the benefit for us? There is no benefit. And we can't see any. We can't feel any. We can't even see down the track. Where's our benefit going to come from and when? And so it's a question of leadership. We hear all the big numbers about the climate crisis, but we don't know what we can do about that. So we're at the, not even at the bottom, we were at the bottom, now we've been kicked out of the bottom, so we don't know where we are. Kicked away from there. So leadership is a very critical issue. And as you can see on our news nearly every night, I think there is a huge deep cry from our youth. I think the things that you're seeing our youth do at this particular stage isn't about crime. It's about a cry, a deep cry. And we haven't heard that cry, nor will we hear it, because we equate that kind of cry with crime rather than with let's listen. And here in this country anyways, we don't have any leadership that helps us to, or gives us any confidence that the issues around climate crisis are going to be addressed seriously enough. And there's a lot of speak, but we don't see any outcome from those political speeches and those platforms that speak about these things here. If our country was to take fossil fuel challenges seriously, then they would not give us another mine, a coal mine, or any other mines, or even any other thing to do with mining on our country, on our lands. But we've got no control over that. We've got no power over it. So it's I think a little bit mystical for me to see that our Aboriginal people, even though we hold that knowledge, we've held it for I don't know how long, but we don't know how that knowledge can now be implemented to actually stop the crisis that we're facing, not even amongst Aboriginal people here in Australia, but around the world. And we're trying our hardest just to save what we have. And that's tough enough when you've got this huge, big government and mining industry behind them to actually wipe out any more rights that we have. So it's a struggle. That's our challenge. I mean, the global standard, in my opinion, of a country that can deal with the climate crisis or has already dealt with it, has always been Costa Rica. They dealt with it, but they got rid of their military. Here we're looking at buying a $300 billion sub. One sub. Don't know what it's going to do. I don't know how it's going to, benefit Aboriginal people or the climate crisis. But that's the stupidity of our leadership. That's the crisis that we see in leadership. But we don't hear also on the opposite side, not just in politics, but from the religious leadership, their voice. It's silent. We don't hear the religious voice. And that could be any religious voice. You've got the three great religions. What are they saying? Sweet nothing. They're over there fighting each other perpetually and possibly living off the fossil fuel industry. I don't know. In the sense, I'm beyond caring because I've got to figure out what I'm going to do for my people next week and trying to keep the kids out of jail or attend to another funeral service. It's that kind of stuff. Desperation is a very small word that tries to identify the depth of the challenges that we face as Indigenous peoples. I'm sorry for being a bearer of bad news, but that's where we're coming from. We're not coming from a place of hope, but hopelessness.
Pastor? James, did you have any reflections that you might like to share at this point? Or?
Yeah, sure. You know, I keep asking myself why I go to the COPs. We boycotted 2022's COP. And we went last year. In fact, Ray and I were at COP26. Yeah. I noticed Shiva put a question up there for you about that. But you know, it's frustrating. It's heartbreaking. I very rarely come back from any of that's the one meeting I very rarely come back with any positivity. You know, small gains that should be obvious. And then when we go to some of the speaking engagements, we're speaking to the converted, right? We're speaking to all the people going, yes, 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 we agree with you. And then the following year, it's the same faces.
Yeah.
But where I see my role at a COP is the pastoral, working with those negotiators, those people who face that hopelessness every time because they cry. Every time I've been to a COP, the negotiators have walked out in tears. Yeah. Last year, they were still trying to discuss the text, and the text was gabbled while they were still entering the room. And, you know, yet they keep going. You know, they keep going and they keep going. They say, because we have to fight. We have to do this for our people. So to be there and provide some pastoral support is important. But we are seeing, and this is the challenge for us, how do we hope against hope in those moments of desperation? And, you know, communities back home who are being forced to relocate as a result of climate change, and relocation movements or actions that are done haphazardly, you know, it's a struggle, but that reminds us of what we need to fight for. So I recognize that, and I think this is the tension that we face in what we are trying to do. Yeah.
I think Christianity is a big problem here too, through its eschatology.
We have quite a few questions online, so we might.
Sorry.
No. It was
very
just
interesting.
I think it was an important conversation to be had, right? And I think because we've tended to talk about it, but it was great to hear your reflections on it, given your role previously. But if we might throw to some more questions online, if there are any other questions that come through around the table, please.
I've got a question from Aka, and it's a change of pace, something very, very practical. What is your view of the Pacific Engagement Visa, which Australia just rolled out last week in Fiji? There is no reference made to it being a climate change option, and so it seems to be all about economics. Do you think Australia should allow preferential access for climate change adaptation? Australia has not confirmed its selection criteria to date for the 3,000 applicants.
Yeah. So a lot of visas being thrown out at the Pacific. We have this one, we have the family accompaniment visa that's going to be piloted as well with only, I think, 200 families or 200 applicants. And then you have something like the agreement that was signed with Tuvalu. And, you know, 250, 280 Tuvaluans per year to get residency in Australia. But the caveat that comes with that is that Australia has veto basically over Tuvalu's security arrangements and the agreements that they make, and that's being reviewed at the moment by the new Tuvaluan government. And again, I I mean, we're always taught to interrogate the question, and my question is always, to what end are these visas being offered? And what is the intended outcome for Australia, and what do they perceive as from the Pacific? Because a lot of these things are being developed without really understanding the situation in the Pacific. Even the PALM scheme has gone through a review that they're going to announce, PALM 2.0, and these things are work in progress. And I don't know if that's going to be seen as a climate mitigation process, because if it is, there's a lot of work that needs to go into that. Because if we're talking about migration, we're talking about the movement of people, and while Pacific culture, Pacific history over the, not just recent, but over the thousands of years that Pacific Islanders have been traveling across the ocean, we have a migrant culture embedded as much as we do have roots in the land. What are the experiences from Pacifica diaspora? What are the lessons there? What are the processes for people to leave and move over? What are the ways in which they get engaged and from a cultural perspective, embed into a community? There is a Pacific framework for climate mobility and human security that's just been approved last year. And so we know that a lot of Pacific Island countries don't want to talk about, governments don't want to talk about relocation, because the funds that come from adaptation are helping in development. So to build a climate resilient bridge actually means to build a bridge for a community, and that sort of thing. But I think, we need to make sure that these are not just examples of taking advantage of the Pacific in that way of making friends. So I still want to interrogate the reason behind some of these things.
Yeah. Alopi, have we got time for more questions?
We're finishing tonight at 8, according to our ads. So we've got about 20 minutes left. If there are any questions on the floor that people may have, and can I acknowledge also Dr. Damien Spruce, the new chair of the Advisory Council for the Edmund Rice Centre, which he's just taken up his role. And we might just grab some water. I should be doing that. James.
You were talking.
Yeah.
So unless there are other burning questions from the floor at this point, I
might just ask, James, if you've got any reflections on just it's interesting you're thinking about talking about extractive processes and migration as an extractive process, as well as the dangers of extractive advocacy, and but thinking about other extractive processes that might come in the Pacific, and thinking about seabed mining and how they interact with those big, Australia is this massive extractive economy just in the Pacific neighborhood.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the thing that's got to change. The culture of extraction as a business model. That's the only hope we have. And whether that's going to happen or not, that's another issue, right? But we have to articulate it. We have to call for it. Deep sea mining is just so fraught with dangerous possibilities. Today they were showing one of these vacuum things that's going to come along and suck up everything. And if you look at this, Blue Peril is a really important video I encourage everyone to watch, because in that it shows what happens to the so-called, what they call plumes. I mean, it's not the scientific name, but the dust that's brought up as they vacuum the sea floor, and that these things can go, travel for thousands of kilometers because there are no hard walls to stop these things happening. And what it does to the ocean. The ocean, in terms of climate change, is the most precious resource that we have. We're already seeing bushfires all around the world, right, as a result of part of the impact of climate change. 50 to 70% of the oxygen we breathe comes from the ocean. The ocean regulates currents and the whole system that we live in. And yet this last thing that's left is being seen as the next big thing. And that's my danger, that we just continue to shift the extractive industry, the extractive culture of business from one thing to another. That's not the answer. Everybody who needs to make money have made enough money. Yeah, it's the Kimura report that came out last year for the fossil fuel free Pacific of 8 countries to transition, it'll cost 0.5% of the profits of the fossil fuel industry for 1 year. 0.5%. The money's there. It's just people are greedy. So that has to change, We still, just very quickly on the palm schemes and all that, all we hear are the amount of remittances going from Australia, from the workers to the Pacific. We're not hearing how much that Australia benefits from this. We're not hearing how much of the economy is based on these workers. It's all, we're doing favors, and that's not the truth. So we need to have an honest conversation about these things. And that's what we need to do, really get into serious, honest conversations, like we just had.
Answer question, actually. Oh, Pastor Ray.
One question. All Christians around this table here are saying that one of the issues, and I'd like your opinion on it, is the eschatology we have. The fact that the eschatology is so powerful that the belief amongst Christians is the fact that, Jesus is coming back, so he's going to fix it. And that's what we're waiting for. So therefore, that eschatology tells us, don't worry about it. God will fix it in his time. And so that's why we don't engage. Got a thought on that.
The eschatology for me of Jesus coming back is me now doing. That's how I understood. Eschatology is not in next 100 of now. It's Jesus now, it's Aliki. It's me to do something, not. But I was brought up with that mentality, but no, to me now the eschatology is here and now. It's me, my generation.
Can I acknowledge Patele Alikilangi, who's joined us from the church in Huntersville, so thank you for.
We are trying to build a center in the Western District of Tonga. It's 70 kilometers where the eruption of And amazing how everyone is talking about the climate change. Amazing. I'll be rushing after our meeting to another meeting, but that's amazing. I've never seen that before, but it seems now everyone. It was a good that you both brought up how we, from our part, how we, what's the word, to spread that. But it seems now that everyone grassroots are on the.
I think that's important what you shared earlier. Particularly, we just finished Easter. We're in the season of Easter now. The resurrection. Recognizing that we are the body of Christ in the world. That's one. The second for me is that if you look at the history of the planet, the major extinctions that have been going on, and we're in another extinction period. Regardless, climate change is a big issue, but the things that we have been doing in terms of destroying the environment, deforestation, mining, all these things that we've been abusing the planet has led to so much extinction. And if we're waiting for the eschaton, if we're waiting for the end of days for Jesus to come and fix things up, okay, even if that's your point of view, what about all the millions of people and God's creatures that will be suffering until then. Have we no care for that? You know, I think sometimes we use these things as excuses to not act. And that's, for me, the biggest challenge. And the challenge for those churches who are using that to not act because their best member and biggest donor is from a fossil fuel producing country, company or something, you know, I mean, buying into that is, it's not about the then, we're talking about the now. And Jesus, our role is to deal with the suffering of people now, the suffering of the community now, and there are people suffering now. Why wait for others to, you know, I mean, the dinosaurs came and went, will come and go, the planet will survive, but we will be gone.
Might throw to Corinne for your question.
Thank you. His Excellency Anate Tong was here,
Yeah.
I think a couple of weeks ago. And in our conversation with His Excellency, one of the points that was highlighted is that climate crisis isn't just an environmental crisis, it's a fundamental crisis of values. I worry a lot. Like, yes, of course, there has to be a transition from fossil fuels, but I worry a lot that we're jumping from the pan into the fire, because renewables are also going to require a huge amount of extraction and all that comes with that, including impinging on the rights of Indigenous peoples and environmental destruction as well. And I worry that the climate movement has shifted too far away from fighting for the values that we need to fight for and against the values that we need to fight against. So I worry a lot about that. We're no longer talking about the global north reducing its excessive consumption of energy. We don't seem to be talking much about the fact that 20% of the world uses 80% of resources. We're not talking so much about these things. Yeah, would welcome your thoughts about that.
Had a conversation with some Germans, not like Germans living in another country, but Germans in Germany, about the cost of keeping warm in winter. Had a conversation with people living in the UK about people now whose gas gets shut off because they can't afford it. At the heart of the climate crisis is a crisis, a moral crisis. That's what is at the heart. And I think that's the big issue for us, because it's about take, but it's about the culture of scarcity, which is what, unfortunately, what capitalism is built on. And again, thank you, Protestant work ethic, for that great invention. But I'm sure somebody else would have come up with it if they didn't. But this is the challenge. And I think there is, and you know, the church has a lot to answer for its historic engagement in that space, you know, and the endorsing of extraction for centuries, millennia even. But now that we are here, how do we reach out to those who are doing this work to do the deeper work that needs to be done? And I think perhaps this is the particular thing that faith communities, or spirituality perhaps, rather than religions, spirituality can bring. I think there really is a need for us to dig deeper and look at what is it that we value. I mean, you look at COVID, you know, when everything stopped, well, almost everything stopped, right? Podcasts continued and things like that. But for a moment when there was no travel or no big, you know, stuff going on, and people changed. when people were forced with all the luxuries of life, well, those who have access to those luxuries, to stay in their homes, what was it that affected them the most? Connection with other human beings. And I think for me, that's the thing we need, and we had a brief moment, 2020, and everybody was talking differently. 2021, we got a glimpse and we went straight back into it. I feel that, we have to, this is where we need to make the change. How we value relationships, how we engage with one another. And that is really, really hard work. And for me, I believe it's very scary work. It's much easier for us to look out there, look at other people and other things than to look inwards at ourselves. But I think that's where we need to make the change. Because for those of us who don't have as much as others and are still happy, what is it? Those who have nothing and are still grateful for the love of family and things like that. What is that? At the same time, there is a challenge from countries that are not as developed, who have been taught that is what and that's the good stuff. That's something we also have to think about. But really, it's about how do we shift that in communities? How do we shift that in? And this is where most of the work has to be done up there. It's not us. Well, the total percentage of carbon emissions from Pacific Island countries, excluding Australia and New Zealand, is less than 1%. With Australia and New Zealand, it's 13%. Right? We are trying to do something, And so I think that's the shift that we really have to make. And it's a very, very hard shift. And the problem is, perhaps we're only talking around at the surface level. We're only dealing with the symptoms, But to have hope, people have to do something. And these are the things that they're doing to give us hope in that, in this time.
I think it's what Leonard Cohen said, repent. What do we mean by repent?
Yep.
I think that's what we need to get back to.
Yes.
What is repentance?
Well, with that note, I think we've had such a rich discussion. I just got a text from Reverend Lorenzo Rodriguez from the Balmain Church to say how much he's enjoyed tonight's discussion and how rich discussion it has been. And I can acknowledge that. And apologies to everyone online and those who've asked questions. What we'll do is we'll collate those questions and we may see if we can get some responses from Reverend Bhagwan on a couple of those questions if we can. But we are coming to the end of the night, and I wanted to thank everyone in the room, but also everyone online and who have stayed online for this whole session. It's been fantastic to have you all. Obviously, we could speak for hours on just this topic alone, and I think it's something which we need to continue the conversation, and we need to continue the talanoa around what this actually means, not just for the Pacific, but for the world.
Yes.
And I think that's something which we've started another conversation tonight on. And so I wanted to just say thank you, Reverend Bhagwan, from all of us here. And I'll give a small round of applause if that's okay for the room. And obviously those are there. We are going to ask one more favor of you, along with all the other extra favors we've asked. If you might select 2 names from this. We undertook a supporters survey just to get a bit of an understanding of what supporters want from the Edmund Rice Centre, and want to see more of, want to see us engaging in and participating in, and how we want to do this in future. And we had such a good response, but we offered as an incentive a couple of gifts there, and we said we'd draw it tonight as part of that. So if you wouldn't mind drawing a couple of names out, and I'm not sure if they're online, but we'll certainly provide those.
You each win 2 liters free fuel.
I wish it's Dimmock's vouchers.
It's coconut fuel. Bruce, how you doing, man? Okay, I'm gonna draw. Okay.
They're very familiar.
Tony Hamilton.
Well, thank you, Tony. Congratulations. You're the first.
And I'm going to move my hand around. One. Makalesi Ngata.
Makalesi, you'll be our second. We might just draw one more in case we need it. So that's okay.
We can't get
If
it.
we can't get it, so.
It's blank. No, it's the other side. Carol Dassi.
So
Beautiful.
congratulations to those people. And thank you all for those who have participated in our research. It will be very helpful for us going forward. And can I also say before we end tonight, a little gift from us for, taking the time to spend. So I have to say we have been blessed with Reverend Bhagwan for this whole week. And not only is he, as I said, doing this tonight, he's doing the Epeli Hau'ofa lecture, he's then also doing a range of master classes with, a master class with scholars from the Pacific Studies who are doing research in Pacific, as well as a Talanoa on Friday here at the centre. So we're very grateful for the time that you've allocated to us, and you're such a busy person, and to have you for this amount of time is amazing. So we thank you for that. So without further ado, we're going to have dinner tonight here at the centre. So all of you, now that you have taken and I thank you all for being part of this conversation. And can I all wish you a good night, and we'll hopefully see you all soon. And for those who may be interested in the Epeli Hau'ofa lecture, it is being recorded and will be put up later, but unfortunately can't be broadcast on the night. So we are capturing it, and it will be up for future reference. But thank you.
Uncensored.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. See you tomorrow, Shiva. Naka Epeli.